When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
In a sense, to me, you kind of play bass like a frustrated guitar player. It's sort of an inverted kind of genius. Was the bass kind of forced on you when your bass player died?
No, it was before that. It was started off. The whole history is that my dad bought me a trumpet, and I tried to play trumpet and learned the Saints and a couple of things, but my lip was going funny, and I realised I wouldn't be able to sing while I was playing a trumpet. I liked singing, so I traded that in for a guitar, which was a right-handed one. I couldn't work out how I couldn't play it. And I eventually realised I had to turn it the right way.
You and Jimi Hendrix, yeah.
So I turned it like the right way, and amazingly, upon amazing, it felt good, and I was strumming with the right hand now, the correct hand, and I could get a lot more feel on it. And I got a guitar to go out to Hamburg, which is called a Rossetti Lucky 7. It was like one of the worst ever made. It was just a hunk of plywood with a pickup on it. And
strings 2 feet off the board.
Yeah, it's the worst action going, but it looked good, and that was the whole thing then. So I got to Hamburg and played for a while just as a guitar player, and just played guitar. We used to have 3 guitars. It was John, me, and George, and we used to say to people, "We don't need a drummer. The rhythm's in the guitars, man." When they used to book us, they say, "I haven't got a drummer." We said, "The rhythm's in the guitar." So we went there, and we had a drummer then, and then we had Stu on bass. Stu decided he wanted to stay in Hamburg, and my guitar by that time had fallen apart. It eventually got smashed, in a pre-Townsend Fury one night, and I used to sort of just piece it together and then plug it in with not plug it in rather, just play it unplugged in. And then I got put up, it eventually just fell apart. There's no way I could even pretend to use it anymore. So I turned to the piano, because that was the only instrument left for me. So I had a little spell of just playing piano, which time I kind of learned quite a little bit, learned my way a little bit around piano. And then eventually Stuart, who was our bass player, was going to stay in Hamburg, and so there was a kind of changeover, and he handed over to me, and he lent me his bass, and I had to play that upside down because he didn't want the strings turned over and messed around too much. So I was playing bass upside down. It's a real cockeyed way.
You played DG8. You played the strings
upside down. I just played guitar boogie in a mirror.
Yeah.
I just played boom, 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 coming this way instead of going down. So that was a kind of crazy time, but I managed that, and then eventually I got my own bass, and I was kind of in on bass. So I was always like a frustrated guitarist.
At that point, Paul was still playing a guitar. And I remember saying, well, one of us is going to be the bass player. I remember saying, and it's not me, I'm not doing it. And John said, I'm not doing it either. He went for it.
Hello and welcome to episode 315 of Something About the Beatles podcast. And this is one that is a outgrowth of the November 2025 Everything Fab 4 conference in Asbury Park, New Jersey. In as much as I connected personally with a guy who's been on my radar for a while, Rob Collier, whose niche in Beatle world is Beatle bass lines. He has been transcribing all of the Beatle bass lines from the beginning, starting with Love Me Do, is I think about 2/3 of the way through the process now. But he's been writing about Beatle bass lines, Paul McCartney specifically, and you can find his work online at bassmusicianmagazine.com. You can also follow his YouTube channel, Beatles Bass Lines. He is also on Instagram, and his website is BeatlesBassLines.com as well. He is probably the foremost person to any great depth who have analyzed and examined what's going on precisely with the bass on Beatles records. Now, Paul McCartney just finished his Got Back tour in my hometown. We know about him as a singer, as a songwriter, producer, everything else he's done. And I don't think we've really taken a look at the bass lines, not certainly to the lengths that we're going to today, but back in 2017, was the first time I had the co-host, as it were, of this show on, and that's Arion Salazar. You may know him as a musician who played with Third Eye Blind and Fungo Mungo before that. Bay Area based originally, and super Beatles guy that through this show I was able to connect with. Just one more great thing in Beatle world, that I'm able to meet these fabulous people that you can just geek out with about all kinds of things. Anyway, episode 123, Arion, when he was in town, we got together and cut a show, ostensibly talk about Paul and bass, but I recall we covered a lot of other ground too, about other stuff. But this is where we connect with a guy who's actually studied it fairly full time and to great depth, Mr. Collier. And so I got Arion along to serve basically as color commentary because I'm not a bassist myself. I've entertained the idea of taking it up someday, just to at least get a basic facility on it. He's the real deal. It's played all over the world in stadiums. He's lived the life as a professional musician, bassist, and Beatle fan. So really the show is an appreciation of Paul McCartney as a bassist, as an innovator, as one of the most influential people to ever take up the instrument. And I'm always brought back to that John Lennon quote in the Playboy interview in 1980, where he says, Paul's an egomaniac about everything but his bass playing, which he's a bit coy about, but that everybody current in the music scene as of 1980, when he spoke these words, he said, was basically ripping off Paul's Beatle period. It's a pretty fine period to rip off, as far as we're concerned. Anyway, this conversation is not in great depth in musicology stuff, although Rob does plenty of that. You will see that in his articles. I wanted to keep it a bit more generalized for the casual listener who just wants to know why Paul was so exceptional as a bassist. And so that's what we set out to do, and that's what we're doing. An overview and appreciation of Beatles bass with Rob Collier and Arion Salazar. Given that Paul McCartney just finished his Got Back tour, and I don't know if anybody saw it.
Expect a lot of you saw it more than once.
At least from the early 2000s on, it seems, on stage he's been playing his Hofner bass. It's a visually pleasing thing. It's iconic and all that, but in his shows he done circa 89, 90, he was playing a different instrument that seemed a lot more modern, at least, suitable for the kind of material he was crafting in the studio at that time. Granted, he's 83 years old. You maybe want to play a light instrument on stage, not have this thing on your back for 3 hours.
Because your Rickenbacker is not much better. I like this one, it's lighter. So the answer is no.
Do you see any reason why he would be doing that beyond purely presentation, that it looks cool and people expect it?
I definitely think the presentation is part of it because that Hofner bass is iconic in a way that his other basses weren't. Like for me, like my favorite McCartney bass is that Rickenbacker that got the psychedelic paint job in 67 and then was stripped to the natural finish, and he played it throughout the Wings era. But for most people, that Hofner, that's the iconic bass. I think people want to see Paul with that bass. Paul and that bass are synonymous to the point that that bass is called a Beatle bass. that's not the official name for that bass, but even Hofner, I think, like comes out with they just call it a Beatle bass. So I think it's probably Paul wants to be seen with that bass that reminds people that he was a Beatle, but it's also 4.5 pounds as opposed to a solid body bass, which could be 9, 10, 11 pounds, 12 pounds. So if you're going to be carrying around a bass for a 3-hour concert, probably easier to have that Hofner. Though when he plays guitar, he plays a Les Paul, which
one of the heaviest guitars.
Yeah, like insanely heavy guitar.
That Hofner is featured you've seen it. He's using the same stage sort of graphics he's been using for 10 years or more. And they're on either side of the stage in the warm up to the concert are 2 massive Hofners. Have you seen this, Robert?
Yes.
So, I mean, they're definitely like pushing the Hofner association with Paul and the Beatles, which is so cool as a bass player to come into a show. And the first thing you see while the intro music is playing are these massive screens projecting a graphic of a Hofner. You know you're in the right place, as a bass player and a musician or whatever.
100%.
And then the other thing, he can get all those tones on that bass, and you really can't. The layman certainly can't hear the difference in a stadium. It's hard to hear bass sometimes in stadium shows anyway. In the McCartney shows, usually they push it so much that actually somehow I think that Hofner cuts well, maybe better than some other basses might in a stadium because it's got this mid-range thing happening. But besides him playing that, no one can tell the difference, number one. And also Brian Ray, the guitar player, plays bass on 4 or 5 songs, and he plays a precision, kind of more modern, traditional sounding bass guitar. So you get both. He's playing McCartney's parts on certain songs when McCartney switches to guitar. So you get a good representation in the show.
Yeah. Sure. And I think, like concert sound has improved to the point where maybe the technical limitations of recording that Hofner bass in 1963 and 64 probably aren't issues anymore. They can EQ the bass to make it cut through. He's playing in these arenas. I saw him 3 times on this tour. One of the shows I saw was in Minneapolis, and he played in a football stadium. He played it where the Vikings play. It was an enormous place. And in places like that, it's hard to really get that bass to cut through, but it does sometimes. The one that stands out in my mind from this tour is Mr. Kite, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. When he plays that, he's essentially playing the bass line that he played on the Sgt. Pepper record, which is a fantastic bass line, and he's playing that really while singing. But I don't know if maybe he told the sound guy, like, I'm going to show off a little bit on bass in this one, so make sure it's audible. But like
the bass is always
line on that one
is pumped at McCartney shows is great.
Yeah, it's awesome.
And that was definitely sort of his sweet spot as sort of really discovering what he could do once he started playing the Rick, and suddenly you could hear it more in the mix. He's using a different methodology in the studio, sometimes using direct injection, plugging the bass right into the board rather than miking the cabinet. So it seems like that's like his golden age where suddenly he'd always been a great bass player. He'd always been a Paul McCartney. But when he switches to an instrument, there seems to be an inspirational aspect to him that, as you pointed out, coincided with the advanced evolution of their songwriting at the same time.
Right, yeah. I think there are like so many things that converged in late 1965 that for me, like Rubber Soul is the turning point for Paul McCartney as a bass player. And it's a number of different things that happened around this time, like their improvement or growth as songwriters, where they're not just kind of writing like AABA songs in this like really traditional format. Sometimes they still use AABA forms, but they're being more experimental in their songs and in their songwriting. So I think he realizes that this traditional approach to bass, where he had just been playing kind of root fifth bass lines or just playing the roots of the chords, like those root fifth bass lines are just like a standard part of a bass player's vocabulary. So that's root fifth, root fifth, root fifth, root fifth. Bass players spend a high percentage of their lives playing those root fifth bass lines, and they show up in like country music, R&B music, rock and roll music. I used to play a lot of bluegrass. It's like the only thing you play in bluegrass music. But McCartney played so much of those root fifth bass lines in the early years that were entirely appropriate for the songs that they were writing. But as they get into this more kind of experimental approach to writing their songs, those like traditional bass lines are no longer sufficient. Like he has to be more creative, more imaginative for these more imaginative songs. And being influenced by James Jamerson on Motown Records, Duck Dunn on Stax Records, and hearing this bass, the sound of this bass coming from these American records kind of opened his eyes to what bass could be in a pop song. But yeah, starting to play that Rickenbacker on the Rubber Soul album, it had a more even and consistent tone. It had a really punchy tone so that it could cut through the mix better than his Hofner could, at least with the recording techniques that were available to them at the time. And it was kind of consistent anywhere he played on the neck. So he could play really high and it would cut through. He could play really low and it would cut through. Whereas the Hofner had these places where this part of the neck is kind of boomy and this part of the neck is kind of weak. So yeah, so he could play these more active lines on the Rickenbacker and they could actually be heard on their recordings.
And that's the period Rubber Soul, Revolver, Pepper, but then comes 68, they're gifted all this gear from Fender, and he switches to the jazz bass then?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of the White Album he's playing the jazz bass. I've read like it's all jazz bass, and then I've read like maybe half of it is jazz bass, half of it's still the Rickenbacker.
I feel like you can hear maybe some of the jazz bass stuff. It's got this like top with like what sound like round wound or some kind of really bright like trebly, almost more end whistle tone, not playing but tone. Like on Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey and Glass Onion.
Yeah.
They sound different somehow.
Yeah. They've got like kind of a sharper attack. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so we know during Let It Be, he's back to the Hofner because we see it. And then Abbey Road, do we know what he's using then?
I think Abbey Road is back to the Rick on a lot of stuff. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about that. I think there's the Hofner on some stuff too.
It doesn't sound like the jazz bass. That jazz bass period is so weird because it comes in and there are these few songs where some of the bass, I always wondered, is it ADT on that track? Or maybe he doubled it, or maybe somebody else is doing a tic-tac thing with his Fender 6. I don't think it gets that deep. I just think that jazz bass, whatever tone they got out of it and used for those few songs, was really unique in the Beatles catalog. It just stands out. And that, yes, Abbey Road, they go back to more what you've been hearing in the years previous. Probably the Rick.
It is interesting how they would experiment in such completely unorthodox ways when it came to any instrument at all. They would do different things. They would try this sound, try this sound. There's the photos we've seen of the session during Rubber Soul, I think for Michelle, where he's got the capo on the bass. And then there's something that through the Rock Band stems was revealed to us when you listen to that one track of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, where there's apparently a 12-string doubling the bass line. Just to conceive, this might be a good idea. Let's try it.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody knew that 12-string was on that track until the Rock Band stems, because it's not super apparent in the mix. Something's going on here, but you don't know what it is, Mr. Jones, kind of thing. It just makes for a really cool sonic palette without really knowing quite how they arrived at it.
They were, particularly from 65, from Rubber Soul on, they were just willing to try anything. That capo on the bass during Michelle there's absolutely no reason to ever play a bass with a capo on. I don't think. I can't think of a reason to ever play a bass with a capo on it, unless you're playing something where you need open, like you're playing something high, but then you need an open string. Maybe then a capo would be useful, but there's a Bass Player magazine interview from 95 with McCartney where the interviewer shows him this photo of him playing bass during the Rubber Soul sessions with this capo on. And McCartney's like, I have no idea why I was doing that. He didn't remember doing it. He couldn't figure out why he would have done it, other than that they were just trying to find a new sound. And it was like, if this is going to give him a new sound or give him a new way of thinking or playing, it was worth a shot. And like on Paperback Writer and Rain, they experimented with recording the bass instead of with a microphone. They wired that White Elephant speaker in reverse, so the speaker was acting like a giant microphone. And that was also an experiment that I think it was fine. Like, it was good enough for those songs, but it wasn't something that they were like, oh, we got to keep recording bass that way. Like, it didn't make that much of a difference, I don't.
Well, it's interesting because they did it for the two sides of the single. So they were thinking in terms of where this would get airplay and not anything else on the Revolver album. And also, we want that deep bottom sound we're hearing on the Stax records, so much so that they nearly recorded Revolver in Memphis, but didn't for various reasons.
Yeah.
Also, just that they recognized pretty quickly why people don't record that way when the lathe cutter was like jumping out of the groove, and they had to recalibrate for that because the bass was so fat and thick that it was actually causing technical problems.
Right. Yeah, it was a worthwhile experiment, but yeah, ultimately not something that they needed to keep working with.
Right.
It goes without saying, but how lucky we are that they had the time and the impetus to be that adventurous in the studio. Because, man, the studio is just so fun. I can only imagine, and we're lucky for that too, right? Because we learned some of the tricks that they discovered.
We're lucky that they were successful right out of the box, that they got that blank check to be able to do that kind of stuff.
True, yeah.
What a luxury.
And that they were working with a team who was willing to let them experiment. I mean, George Martin in particular, but those engineers who were willing to just try to figure out whatever kind of weird sound or novel sound, everybody was willing to go with them.
That they were connected with a producer who had been making novelty records.
Yeah, totally.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Now, Rob, you've been doing this series of transcribing all the McCartney bass lines to a degree of detail that is like unheard of, but is so satisfying for people that are into that knowledge. You want to describe that for the listeners who might not be aware of the articles you've written for Bass Musician and the work you've been doing?
Yeah, so I started, I had written some articles for Bass Musician magazine, maybe been a decade now.
2012 is what I saw, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, it's been a while, but I wrote a few articles on McCartney's bass lines, and then some articles, wrote one on Rick Danko, one on Duck Dunn, a few other bass players, Phil Lesh from the Grateful Dead. But more recently, in the last few years, I just started this kind of personal project of, I'm going to start transcribing McCartney's bass lines chronologically, like starting with Love Me Do and then the Please Please Me album. And kind of as a way of like, I want to document McCartney's growth as a bass player. And these were bass lines that I had played a lot of them already, and I had been listening to them since I was a teenager. But I decided, like, I'm going to get way inside these bass lines. And, there are other published transcriptions. There's the Beatles complete scores that came out in the late 80s, I think, which essentially has like everything transcribed. I'm going to put quotes around everything transcribed. But the bass lines aren't super detailed. There's some errors. One of the most frustrating things for me is that they would put repeat signs around a verse. Like they would transcribe one verse and then just put repeat signs around it as if the second verse was going to be exactly the same. And often the second verse is not exactly the same as the first verse. So one of the things that was interesting to me is what's different? What did McCartney change from the first verse to the second verse? Because you start to hear like him kind of build bass lines from verse to verse. So there are a lot of these like really, really interesting details that were left out of transcriptions like that. And so I started just transcribing these bass lines with as much detail as I could, not just notes and rhythms, but like articulations. Did he play it staccato? Is it smooth? Did he kind of slide into the note? Did he slide off of the note? Is it a hammer-on? Is it, all like as much detail as I can put in there? Yeah, I'm trying to get that in the transcriptions. And then at some point I started thinking, well, like I'll make videos of me playing these bass lines that I'm transcribing. That wasn't even originally a part of it, but has become a big part of it now. I have a YouTube channel and Instagram channel where I post videos of me playing these bass lines, trying to get as close to what McCartney played as possible. And I usually also like try to mix the bass really high, like me playing the bass, try to get that really, really high in the mix. Cause I think a lot of Beatles fans maybe have heard like McCartney's supposed to be a great bass player, but they've never really been able to pick the bass line out or like focus on the bass line. So yeah, I try to get the bass line cranked as much as I can so people can hear like what kind of wild stuff McCartney was doing in the song.
And if they're not buying the Giles mixes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Giles turns up the bass in a lot of those mixes and also kind of makes
the low end.
Yeah, he boosts the low end, just kind of fills up that low frequency spectrum, which even though the bass is louder, sometimes it feels boomier or like muddier, like less clear on those original, like Pepper in particular. McCartney's bass is just like so crystal clear and it doesn't have that heavy bottom end that Giles Martin put on.
That's their attempt to make it sound contemporary, maybe to reach, we were talking about before, to reach a new audience, younger people, so that it sounds more like what they might hear on a current pop record. Yeah, that's a tough thing to do because it wasn't meant to be that way.
I guess if it's meant to be a gateway to bring in people too young to have experienced them earlier, and it turns them into Beatle fans, I guess it is serving its purpose, but it's not the Beatles' design and shouldn't be regarded as such. These are not replacements for the original Beatle tracks, but they are a version that maybe some people like the extended 12-inch disco version. You may like this version of the song, just don't mistake it for the canon that the Beatles intended, because it is not that.
Right, yeah. I love hearing these songs. Anything that lets me hear the songs in a new way, I absolutely love. And so I really enjoy hearing Giles Martin's mixes, and I listen to them a couple of times, and then I'm usually kind of right back to the 2009 remasters are usually my go-tos. And so I'm always interested in what Giles Martin does, but they don't become the version that I listen to regularly.
So in your methodology, do you find if you're stuck on something into 2009 or some other previous iteration, you can go to some of these Giles remixes or some even of the early takes of things, and that will shine the light on something that you couldn't decipher previous?
Yeah, definitely. I usually start with the mono or stereo mixes or the 2009 remasters of those mono and stereo mixes. But you can hear different things in the mono version versus the stereo version. And sometimes, particularly on the early albums, the bass gets so buried in the mixes. And so the songs that ended up on the remaster or remixed Red and Blue album from a couple years ago, Giles Martin's remixes of those songs, a lot of times it's easier to hear the bass on like A Hard Day's Night or those songs that made it to that compilation. And then
there were the Rock Band stems.
Then the Rock Band stems are really helpful. Yeah. Some of those are cleaner than others. Like some of them are still just like, yeah, this is not a pleasant thing to listen to.
Right, those noisy artifacts in them.
Yeah.
And people shouldn't mistake them for being the actual multi-tracks because they're not that. It's not like the isolated tracks at all.
Right. Yeah. So it's nice to have all of those different versions because some versions gets a little bit easier to pick out something that he's doing on the bridge or, something that's buried in one of the mixes might be really clear in another.
I remember for a previous show, I can't remember the show or why I was making this particular point, but I was wanting to find an isolated bass track of Paul playing on Boys, and I didn't have a rock band stem for it, but then I found the recording they did at the Liverpool Theater, whatever it's called, in December 63 for the It's the Beatles TV special. The sound, the board mix was so terrible that for Boys, all you could hear was the bass. So I was
wow.
this is as good as an isolation. So
Yeah.
every once in a while you luck out.
Yeah, yeah. Like you mentioned, the anthology version, sometimes the bass is clearer. He's not always doing the exact same thing in an earlier take, but a lot of times, it might be close enough that you can hear, oh, yeah, that's what's happening in the song.
So for what he was doing, certainly for all his Beatle career, definitely gaining prominence circa 65, 66. The kind of bass lines he's putting into Beatle recordings that certainly have been described as melodic. And I think in that sense, what normally would be sort of shoring up the bottom end in a recording is suddenly gaining prominence in songs like Nowhere Man, for instance, Drive My Car, things like that, where bass is suddenly, not only is it more audible in the mix, but it's actually orchestrated in a way that is at variance from the lead vocal or a guitar riff, that it's like a melody line unto itself that you can hum or stick in your head like an earworm. How singular was that in the pop rock world of that era?
I mean, there was a precedent for it in James Jamerson. Jamerson was the Motown bass player who played on almost all of those mid-60s recordings by the Supremes and the Temptations, Four Tops and Marvin Gaye and Martha and Vandellas, all of those people. They all kind of have the same house band, and James Jamerson was the house bass player who would play these essentially melodic bass lines that would move through the chord chains rather than just kind of playing just the roots of the chords or just that kind of root fifth traditional approach to bass. James Jamerson was creating these bass lines that had this sort of longer shape, these kind of creating longer phrases. And so McCartney has said that Jamerson was his hero in that era, though I think it was much later before he actually knew who the bass player was. He would just listen to these recordings. That bass is phenomenal. And so even though the Beatles weren't really making Motown-esque songs, like there's some kind of soul stuff on Rubber Soul, but like Nowhere Man is essentially a folk rock song, but McCartney plays this bass line that just moves through the chord progression. And so, this is the bass line that McCartney's playing on the verse of Nowhere Man. Most bass players would have approached that chord progression as like, I'm going to play like root and fifth of these chords. And that would have been totally fine. Like that would have been appropriate. McCartney could have done that. But instead, he takes this kind of Jamerson approach of playing this melody that, moves through the whole verse. And he's not doubling the guitars. He's not doubling the vocals. He created a new melody that he's playing on bass. And it becomes like a counter melody to the vocal melody. It's a kind of counterpoint rather than, just, sitting in the rhythm section, playing the roots of the chords, holding down the groove. He plays this really active melodic line.
It's almost spotlight.
He sees his spotlight, and also he's outlining the chords, but it does become like a string part, like almost maybe a cello part to itself, never overshadowing anything else or stepping on anything, but moving it and bringing it up,
Yeah, it becomes like chamber music. Like if you listen to a string quartet piece, the cello, which is the bass instrument in a string quartet, isn't just going to be playing the roots of the chords. It's playing a moving line, and it's playing counterpoint to the string instruments above it, viola and the two violins. So McCartney is taking the bass. It's still in the rhythm section. He's still like holding down the groove and holding down kind of the bottom end of the song. And like you said, he's outlining the chords, but he makes the bass line like an active melodic voice in the song.
It's a folk rock song. I mean, it's like maybe a Birds type thing. McCartney brings in this thing that's got this funk. Ringo, there's a pocket and a groove happening in that song that takes it somewhere else. So it's still sort of beautiful, but yeah, it's kind of funky. I mean, it's super funky.
It is.
Actually. It's got a great pocket. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It moves.
Say more about that, locking with Ringo in terms of the value of a bassist and a drummer that are listening to each other.
That's a whole show, basically. I think this is maybe one of the Beatles' most important secret weapons was Paul and Ringo were funky, just straight up. Like some of the tracks, there's a bunch of them, but You Know My Name or Flying from Magical Mystery Tour, that instrumental, it sounds like a Tribe Called Quest groove or a De La Soul groove. It's like that 90s psychedelic hip-hop swing. Doom, goom. I mean,
I think Baby You're a Rich Man, too, has that kind of heavy groove.
Yes. So somehow they got hip to that early on. Ringo they're naturally had it. I know they listened to R&B music and they loved it, but they're white British kids. Somehow those two guys, and Paul certainly, and Ringo, had funk and a pocket that helped put the Beatles sort of above a lot of other bands.
Yeah, I think groove is so important in pop music or rock music. And Ringo and Paul had this groove together. And yeah, a lot of people think of Ringo as like not a great drummer. He wasn't a flashy drummer. Yeah, but like
greasy.
Yeah, the drums are so important in rock music because they give it that feel, and the bass has to lock in with that feel. If Ringo wasn't a good drummer, those songs wouldn't have felt like that. But they have this like deep groove it doesn't matter how simple the part is that Ringo's playing or if Paul's playing a simple part, that feel, that pocket that they create together is so important.
It makes it all the more miraculous that there's this tiny window between Ringo joining the band in August of 62 and 3 weeks later or less, they're recording Love Me Do, their first single for Parlophone. Now, Paul to this point had been used to playing with a very different drummer who, God bless Pete Best, didn't have the scope or imagination that a Ringo did. Ringo, through his apprenticeship at Butlin's, was tasked to play a variety of styles in a way that Pete didn't. He was a straight-up rock and roll drummer based on everything we've heard from him and in what he'd been tasked with playing in club. So here's Ringo. The sky's the limit with him. How incredibly liberating that must have been for Paul. It's like, now I can act on my wildest imagination. Who demonstrably was not locked into straight up rock and roll. His palette was as wide as the imagination as well. And he was a guy that could play guitar, attempted lead guitar to that point, could play keys, had whatever experience he had on trumpet, but he thought in the entire array of instrumentation. And now he's suddenly with a drummer who's just as wide open. And suddenly he can do all kinds of things that maybe he was held back from doing before, limited to that very narrow spectrum of the beat group club band that they were.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you said liberating, like that's a perfect word for it. Just freeing. Yeah. They locked in with each other so quickly. Experienced musicians do pickup gigs and like get hired for a gig, and I've never played with these players before and I've got to lock in with them starting at 6 p.m. tonight or whatever. But both of those musicians, Paul and Ringo, were experienced musicians by that point and had played thousands and thousands of hours. And so they fell into each other's grooves like so quickly and naturally. It's really incredible.
It makes you wonder if it really changed Paul's way of thinking as a bass player. It was an instrument he didn't aspire to in the first place. It was sort of foisted on him, as he's fond of telling. And he goes on to become one of the most innovative people in the rock world, certainly of the 1960s. What is it you would say that set him apart from his contemporaries? If you look at the British bands of the day, The Who, The Stones, Yardbirds maybe, what do you think set him apart from them? I mean, it seemed to be certainly an astonishingly fruitful period for people to suddenly break past the paradigms of rock and roll as they knew it to that point, getting into psychedelia, bringing in Eastern sounds, just doing all kinds of stuff that just widened the paradigm very wide, very fast.
Yeah, well, he was a remarkable bass player, but he started as a traditional bass player. In the first few years of the band, he was a very, very traditional bass player. And so that harmonic knowledge that you talked about, like he could play all of these instruments and he could hear the entire arrangement. Yeah, in a way, it's no surprise that eventually transferred to his bass playing. But even up through the Help album, like so much of the Help album, he's playing chord roots, root and fifth. Robert, you and I were both at the Everything Fab 4 Fest conference on Rubber Soul a few weeks ago, and the presentation that I gave was on McCartney's bass lines on Rubber Soul. And one thing that I did in preparation for that presentation was I counted all of the notes other than root and fifth in the entire Help album. And then I counted all of the notes other than root and fifth in the Rubber Soul album, in Paul's bass lines. And I can pull up those numbers real quick because it's like a staggering difference. Those, like the root and fifth, are like anchors of a chord. They're really strong, stable notes, but they're not always the most interesting notes. But bass players, we spend our lives playing root and fifth. And so Paul playing a ton of root and fifth stuff on Help, that was normal bass player stuff. He was correct to do that. But so on the Help album, he played notes other than root and fifth 491 times. On Rubber Soul, he played notes other than root and fifth 1,247 times. 491 to 1,247. And then I broke it down into averages per song, averages per minute, averages per measure. In all of those cases, his essentially the movement doubled in Rubber Soul. The movement in those bass lines doubled. The notes other than root and fifth more than doubled from the Help album to the Rubber Soul album. So it was just all of a sudden, you almost listening to the Rubber Soul album, you hear Paul McCartney having an epiphany as a bass player that these bass lines could be something else. He didn't just have to play root and fifth or root notes of the chords. He could play this wild melodic bass line on Nowhere Man. He could play the You Won't See Me bass line is just as active and just as beautiful as the Nowhere Man bass line that he absolutely would not have played even just earlier in the year on Help.
Now, I bet if you take your study back to the Decca audition, you will find that scope narrowed even further still.
I'm sure. Yeah, you talking about the difference between the Decca audition, with Pete versus even just later in the year with Ringo. It's not something that I've done in my transcriptions, but it would be really, really fascinating to do.
Yeah, sure.
And then eventually I got my own bass and I was kind of in on bass. So I was always a frustrated guitarist playing bass.
Those melodic lines, particularly the ones that showed up on Sgt. Pepper, there was no precedent for that in rock music.
Because I was just getting on with bass and just always the stuff I'd always liked had been little lines that worked and yet had their own little identity instead of just staying in the background. By then anyway, bass was coming up to the fore in mixes. As you listen to early Beatle mixes and the bass and the bass drum aren't there. We were starting to take over ourselves and bass was coming to the fore anyway, so I had to do something with it when it was getting in the fore. I was listening to a lot of kind of Motowns and Marvin Gaye and Stax and stuff, which were putting some nice little bass lines in. But I think the big influence was Pet Sounds, Beach Boys. That was the album Flip Me. Still does, actually. Still one of my favourite albums of all time. Just because the musical invention on that is wow. But that was the big thing for me. I just thought, oh, dear me, this is the album of all time. What the hell are we going to do? So my ideas took off from that standard and I wanted to do stuff beyond that. So my bass playing started, I don't know if that was a direct result of that, but I was thinking along those lines.
Now, with this sweet era of exploring the outer limits with his Rickenbacker, there's a lot to talk about on Pepper that you've described as like a real high point in terms of his bass innovations. Are there any specific songs? No, Lovely Rita is one of the ones that you've cited in your work as something truly exceptional.
Lovely Rita is my all-time favorite bass line. I don't necessarily think it's the best bass line that McCartney ever played. I think probably Something from Abbey Road is like that's his like masterpiece almost as a bass player. Yeah. But Lovely Rita, that's my favorite bass line because it's like an encyclopedia of patterns for bass player. Like it's almost like an etude. It's like a bass etude. You learn the Lovely Rita bass line and you all of a sudden have all of these patterns at your disposal that like so many of those patterns then showed up on other songs on the Pepper album. They show up in his bass lines on the White album, on Abbey Road. It's like he came up with like, it's not a new pattern for every measure, but like there's some repetition of those patterns, but it's so many different bass patterns that are these perfect patterns for creating a melodic bass line.
He loved using those triads all the time. And Lovely Rita, you're right, it is such a nice track. Another one, super funky with rad staccato, like just crazy backbeat from Ringo and McCartney on top, really laying in like almost like a Sly Stone record, like Larry Graham, that same kind of feel. And then he's also got those doom gang doom bow doom dang doom gow, those slides. He's got those slides he's starting to do on that track that he always uses a lot, like sort of in the next few records you hear him more and more. Yeah, you're right. Lovely Rita is incredible.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And you also write about this thing of that being a really good song for like maybe a bass player to learn, a beginner bass player to learn and get a sort of vocabulary down that you could then use. You've got the triad thing, you've got the scales moving up, scales moving down. It's a great learning song.
Totally. Yeah. And it's like almost like a walking line. Like so much of the line is just in straight eighth notes. But like you said, there's like staccato stuff. He like scoops into notes. He falls off of notes. It is expressive the entire time. It's never just this kind of like static or monotonous kind of bass line. Let me see if I can play a little bit of this bass line just like if people haven't really thought about the bass line in this song. Also, I'm going to play this cold. This is not like it's not a song that I've practiced.
No pressure.
Recently. Okay, so this is like, I'll start on the first verse of the song. Right, just like constant motion, outlining these chords with arpeggios, so like playing the triads, but also, yeah, like you said, ascending scales, descending scales, walk ups, walk downs. It's just like endless invention on the bass. And it sort of becomes like almost like a Rosetta Stone to his bass playing because you start to like then hear like, that pattern that he plays in Hello Goodbye, like that's from Lovely Rita. This pattern that he's playing in Cry Baby Cry or Sexy Sadie or Dear Prudence, like that's coming from, like all of those showed up in Lovely Rita.
Wow, you're right.
Yeah.
So that's a great way to put it. I love that.
Yeah.
Rosetta Stone.
It's my absolute favorite McCartney bass line. And part of it is because I feel like I become a better bass player when I learn it, when I practice it, when I play it, because I get all of these like really great bass patterns reinforced every time I play it.
And if you get into the weeds like you are, and you learn the feel, and like he's different feels within the same two bars, with length of notes and stuff. We're going into nerd world, but you can learn a lot from that one track. It's a good point. And speaking
Yeah.
of string parts, that's very much like maybe a cello part or something.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, especially those arpeggio things. Like that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Very kind of like Mozart's left hand in his like piano sonatas.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of consistency or any sort of pattern you pick up on in him picking with his fingers versus playing with a pick throughout the Beatles' career? Was he very consistent, or do you see very specific instances where he switches from one way to the other?
He was almost always a pick player. You see him playing with his fingers occasionally in like promotional videos. Like I think the Hello Goodbye video, he's playing with his fingers, and in some of the Day Tripper videos, maybe he's playing with his fingers, where they're just miming to a recording. A lot of times he will play with his fingers, but I feel like most of the time in the studio and live, he was always playing with a pick.
Those tunes are definitely pick songs. The two you just named. And I would say that he maybe went to fingerstyle for ballads, maybe like very quiet songs like I'll Follow the Sun, where they didn't want an attack. So he's sort of doing like maybe closer to what an upright would sound like. But most of the time he's more expressive with a pick. He's more buoyant, McCartney, joyous energy. I feel like that's a big part of where he's at.
Right.
That's interesting because I'm not a bassist and I never tried to listen to the difference, but I was relying exactly on what you described, the visual clues, watching him in a music video. So you're saying basically that's faked. It's him going through the motions to what's already been played with a pick on the record.
Yeah, definitely. And that like playing with your fingers a lot of times, gets a kind of warmer tone. Playing with a pick, you get more attack. You can get a kind of punchier sound sometimes, but a lot of times that attack is what helps cut the bass, or like it helps the bass cut through the mix. So playing with the pick is part of what makes those songs sound, or makes his bass sound clear in those songs and gives it that kind of punchy sound, particularly in like 66, 67.
And then one thing I would say is, I'm sure you've got into this, is palm muting, especially with the Hofner. You sort of have to do a little bit of palm muting, meaning you're dampening the strings a little bit with this part of your hand.
Yeah.
And he's just naturally fell into that, I guess. But maybe you've seen people pick up Hofners before and try to play them like a regular bass, and it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
But McCartney really did this thing and was able to make that bass sing by his use of, which I feel like is bass nerd stuff, but it's an important part of how he did it.
Yeah, it was a part of his sound, and those Hofner basses, they're not like regular basses. Like they have their own kind of peculiarities, and generally like on some basses you can really like dig in, play really hard and get a kind of aggressive tone. I think probably Hofners sound worse the harder you play them.
Yeah.
So like they often require a kind of light touch. That palm muting, he gets this kind of like nice, warm, round sound, like kind of thumpy bass sound, but still with that attack of the pick.
That's a really good point you guys both bring up, is how much the very first bass he acquired, because he didn't play a regular bass prior to, he had like a guitar with piano strings on it, but his first real bass was the Hofner, how much that would have influenced his development as a player and his imagination into, what is my role here? What am I going to do? Well, I've got this instrument and this is the scope of it, so I'm going to develop as a bassist with what this instrument can do, as opposed to a P bass or something else he might have picked up.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, he learned to play bass on that Hofner, so it became part of his sound, part of his style, which is another reason why that switch to the Rickenbacker made such a huge impact. It probably wouldn't have had the impact if he had just started on a P bass. Like it's not such a big leap to then move to that solid body Rickenbacker.
Yeah, I always loved the serendipity of them being in Germany and him just happening to get this German bass with this very specific thing. There's plenty of music styles you wouldn't go to a Hofner to play. But he's able to pretty much cover all those styles by virtue of learning on the instrument and figuring it out.
Yeah.
And it's so cool.
Yeah. And honestly, like if I were playing like these rock and roll, a Hofner would not be the bass that I would just like instinctively go for. But like that was essentially their repertoire, or there was a big part of their repertoire when he started playing basses, these old 50s rock and roll songs and like rhythm and blues stuff. I definitely would have gone for a P bass. A Hofner would not have been my first choice, but it's a fascinating thing that that's the bass that he ended up with.
Serendipitous, for sure.
Yeah.
I wonder, I don't know if anybody happens to know off the top of their head. I'm trying to think back in pictures I've seen of their contemporaries, the people playing the Hamburg, Liverpool club circuit. What were their bass players playing? I would imagine some kind of solid body, possibly a Fender bass.
That's
I really
probably
don't know.
You're probably seeing a lot of like maybe Burns, or you're seeing European basses maybe, and maybe some Fenders too. The Shadows. Did they play Burns, I think?
I don't know.
That's a good question. I feel like that clip that's in the anthology of where George is talking about like coming back to Liverpool after being in Hamburg and everybody is playing this Shadows stuff and cuts to them doing the dump-da-dump-da-dump-da-dump-da stuff. I feel like that bass player is playing a P bass, but I would not swear to that.
We know
But
that Stewart acquired that big old hollow body, but anecdotally, we're told it was because of the look is why I bought it, because it just looked cool. And he was a small framed guy. We don't really know what it sounded like.
Right.
We saw Stewart playing with the President. Is that what it's called? The bigger one, the big
I think so.
full Hofner. Also a Hofner is a great sounding bass, but the violin bass actually sounds different because it's not so big. It's maybe not as boomy. Very similar, but yeah.
So you've cited something as what you think is like his zenith as the Beatles bass player. We know that we've been told that George had made some kind of comment about Paul being too busy on it, and therefore a lot of people are walking around with this perception that George hated what he did on his song, but that's not the case at all. But can you say more about what it is that elevates something as high as your esteem for it is in terms of Paul McCartney bass performances?
Yeah, so it's a really, really active bass line. It's constantly moving, which that's not always a good thing, but
for a song that builds, it's entirely suitable, appropriate.
Right. And it's like always a very, very expressive bass line. Like he's not just playing like straight 16th notes against this kind of like slow, like mellow groove. He's mixing these kind of long notes, and then he'll go into a run of 16th notes or 8th notes. So it becomes this really, really expressive melody rather than this kind of like, he's not trying to like lock into a metronomic groove. It's really, really expressive. And it's definitely so much busier than it needed to be. Like a lot of bass players would have really played like a very, very simple kind of supportive bass line. And McCartney plays this really, really active bass line, but it's like so much of the movement of his bass line occurs between George's vocal phrase. So it's not like McCartney's like stepping on George's voice. It's almost a kind of like question and answer. There's, this interaction between George's voice and McCartney's bass line.
And Ringo is kind of sparse at that early points in the song, too. So he's got the room to do that without stepping on anything.
100%. Like Ringo's groove, it gradually builds through the song, but in the first couple of verses, he's playing the sparsest drum beat imaginable. I think he plays like maybe 2 or 3 drum fills in the first minute of the song, or even more maybe. Like it's so sparse. Ringo's not taking up any space. There's like a rhythm guitar, but it's mostly strumming chords. There's not a whole lot of movement in the guitar. Strings come in, but the strings are mostly just sustaining chords. They're not moving. An organ comes in, It's mostly just sustaining chords. It's not moving. So for the first half of the song, the only two moving musical parts are George's vocal line and McCartney's bass. And so there's just this kind of counterpoint between these two sort of musical lines that's just beautiful. But then also we move into the bridge and Ringo's part becomes more active. He starts kind of doing a drum beat that moves across the toms. So Ringo becomes more active and McCartney falls back into a kind of straighter, more regular part. It's still a really interesting bass line, but it becomes this kind of straight eighth note part rather than this sort of like free, like bass solo, which it had kind of been up to that point.
I have a theory that I mean, I love the bass line. I just love the bass line, period. But that maybe on some very subconscious level, McCartney, like maybe he sensed the greatness of this track he was playing on, and not like in a subterfuge way, but just went crazy a little more without even knowing why because of that. But because he's McCartney, he just can't play a bad track. He just can't play bad music. So he's right on the, like you're saying, it's like a bass solo pretty much. But it's right on the cusp of being overplaying and just bad. And it's not. Instead, it's great.
Yeah.
But maybe somewhere in there, McCartney was like, this motherfucker just wrote this. I'm gonna show you, somehow, somewhere in there. I don't know. It's my theory.
Well, I think we all kind of agree that there is moments when if it's not Paul's composition, he will be a little bit more extra in what he contributes to it to leave his mark and take his share of the spotlight. Not at all saying this in a bad way, because ultimately it's to the greater good. And you can think of things that he didn't originate, like Tomorrow Never Knows or A Taxman, something like that, where his contributions absolutely elevate it. And I don't think this is any exception with something. I think it's a wonderful bass line. And to go along with his fantastic backing vocal harmonies he does, especially on the bridge with George, it's like, yes, this is a great song. I want a piece of it.
Yeah, totally. It's not his song, but yeah, he wants to be a part of it. He wants to put his mark on this song. So I think there are definitely like Paul's songs where he plays a great bass line. There's a great bass line on basically every song on Sgt. Pepper. But yeah, like his songs, he often has the bass kind of take more of a back seat, a more supporting role. It's not universal, but it often happens. And I think he continued that with Wings stuff. I think he's even talked about how he was focused more on being the front man in the band. He was the leader of the band. He was the lead singer, the songwriter. Arrangements were his work primarily. And so the bass was kind of a secondary thing. There are definitely some really fabulous bass lines in the Wings era. But for the most part in the 70s, his bass playing went back to being like kind of traditional and supportive.
When you started this process of really close listening to the Beatle recordings to transcribe the bass parts, was there anything that after years of listening to these songs and suddenly when you're really drilling down to it to get it right, surprised you that you hadn't been aware of before?
Yes. One thing is, now it's a very obvious thing, but Pepper had always been this like breakout album for McCartney as a bass player. And he's talked about that. Like that's his favorite era of his bass playing, and like knew like, oh, like And Your Bird Can Sing has a great bass line and Nowhere Man has a great bass line.
Right.
But it was really like when I started transcribing this stuff in order that I saw this like clear line in the sand between Help and Rubber Soul. And it was just like, yeah, his genius bass playing didn't start at Pepper, it started at Rubber Soul. Another thing is, it struck me a little bit how improvisational some of the early songs sounded. he had a basic idea of what he was going to play in like a Hard Day's Night era song. But yeah, there are these like little variations. Like All My Lovin' is essentially a composed bass line. Essentially every time the verse comes up, he's playing that sort of descending walking line. But on so many other songs, he has this kind of general idea of what the bass line is going to be, but it's going to be slightly different from take 1 to take 2 to take 3. And then there'll be like, he'll get into these moments of this is what I'm going to play in the bridge. And it's the same every time the bridge comes up. But yeah, he was more improvisational than I had really thought.
Yeah. To the extent that I listen to his bass, which I do focus on different parts when I listen to Beatles recordings, but I would never even claim to be as closely drilling into it as you would be to transcribe it. I became aware at some point early on that the same part of the song coming around the second time, he would do something different, which I thought, and part of me is like, oh, it was so cool when you did the first time, you're not doing it the second time. But I get, as the kind of guy he is, that I'm not going to repeat myself. I'm not going to give you what you expect. I'm going to do something fresh. I'm going to fool you because I'm a Beatle, kind of headspace.
I also feel like McCartney, out of all of them, was, and you can see this on all the live shows, he's always the one screaming off mic to like shout and get people excited. So maybe he's the most conscious or certainly very conscious of like the energy that's coming through him, elevating the track. So that means if he feels something playing the second verse, he's going to maybe put energy into it a different way to make it exciting. You know what I mean? And I feel like he was conscious of that all the time, maybe more so than the other guys. He's really the only one screaming off mic a lot in these different places. We just watching the anthology yesterday, and I knew this already, but it just struck me again. McCartney is into like conscious of like, we're keeping this exciting from moment to moment, and we're taking you on a ride. And so same thing applies to when he's tracking bass, it feels like.
Totally. Yeah. He's like a very in the moment kind of player. And yeah, like speaking of those like kind of whoops and yells and stuff, I just finished this morning part 6, I think, the one that's about Sgt. Pepper and All You Need Is Love. And there's a moment in All You Need Is Love, like kind of between vocal phrases, when McCartney just like lets out this little whoop. And like you see John like look over and smile at him, just like, McCartney was feeling it in the moment and just like, I'm going to let out this little yell.
The spark
He's
plug.
Like a vibe master. Yeah, spark plug. Exactly.
Yeah.
You guys are reminding me of, because I've been in Ivy's Badfinger world this year, the recording of Rock of All Ages that he produced that he plays piano on. And if you listen to, there's not the released version on the Apple album, but there was the version that was put out on the soundtrack on Commonwealth United, which is a different mix. And there's way more McCartney presence up front in it, of him just going to town with the Little Richard bit. And it is so cool to hear. I almost wish they would put that version out, but I could see why they'd want to tamp his contribution down to keep the spotlight on those guys. But it's cool that late in the Beatles' career that he's like back in Hamburg.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm not familiar with that recording.
No, I'm not either. I need to check that out.
Oh yeah, Rock of All Ages there was the 3 songs they did for Magic Christian: Come and Get It, Rock of All Ages, and Carry On Till Tomorrow. And Rock of All Ages is a sort of Little Richard type of number that Tommy Evans is screaming his lungs out. So
nice.
Do check it out, listeners.
Yeah. It's been so long. I've listened to Straight Up and No Dice so much, but I don't go back to Magic Christian music a whole lot.
Well, it's pretty much an Ivy's album, but it has its moments.
Yeah.
So going forward, I wouldn't even dream that you'd be going into transcribing everything he did as a solo artist or Wings, but as a bassist, as a fan, are there particular standout bass lines that you can point to? Arion, I know which one you would point to, I think, because we've talked about it before. A Good Night Tonight.
It's great. That's his Bernard Edwards bit. Right? He's sort of channeling the 3 on E thing or whatever, kind of. But yeah.
Just an amazing performance. That's what makes that record for me, for sure.
By the way, that's like just a brief thing. Yet again, there's a soundcheck jam from the Wings Over America tour that I heard, where it's Joe English, and he could do like straight session player 70s funk, super convincing. And they're doing like a funk jam. And McCartney is absolutely at home, can do it, and it sounds amazing. And it's just, this is something he could access. I'm not sure that the other guys could, and not a lot of those people that came from the British invasion could, was being funky. And so, yeah, that's Good Night Tonight is for that reason, super funky and amazing.
Yeah, that one is such a great bass line. And it's almost like a follow-up to his Silly Love Songs bass line. Great, like really, really groovy bass line. Big Barn Bed from Red Rose Speedway has a bass line I think is so cool. I've transcribed some of the Ram bass lines, Too Many People. There's not bass in a lot of Too Many People. It just kind of comes in these sections, but when it comes in at, I guess, the chorus, it has such a cool groove.
It's that feel.
Yeah.
The feel is beautiful.
Yeah. And then I was just listening recently to his album, Memory Almost Full, and was just like blown away at how cool the bass lines are on that album. And I think maybe he only plays bass on like 2/3 of it. I think Brian Ray is playing on some of it, but McCartney's bass line, it's like the most active bass lines I've heard him play, 1980 maybe.
There's that song, That Was Me.
Yeah.
That was got some great stuff on it. I don't know if that's him. I'm assuming it is.
Now I can't remember which songs. There were like a few in particular where it's just like, this is like vintage McCartney just going for it on bass. And it's so cool to hear.
What instrument do you think he's using?
That's a good question.
I think that was around the time some young producer, I'm not sure if it's Memory Almost Full or New, is produced by Greg. Man, what is his name? He's a keyboard player. He plays with the Bird and the Bee, like a famous LA guy. But I'm pretty sure that around this point, somebody said, please play this Hofner again, and we're going to get you the rain tone now with this technology. So,
Well,
I mean, some of those, go ahead.
I think that Elvis Costello had got him back into playing the Hofner on the Flowers in the Dirt album, but then I don't know if it was like his regular bass in the studio after that, or if it was just he kind of occasionally came back to it. But I do just like picture him playing the Hofner on the Memory Almost Full album, but that's no proof at all.
I remember the 5-string one standing out in my memory when he was doing that. I think circa the 89-90 tour.
Yeah, I think it was a Wal, WAL bass.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Was that the one that sold for a ton of money when it went for auction? I know there was one record-breaking McCartney bass from that era that went for a lot of money when it set records.
I think he played the 5-string on Free as a Bird and Real Love, or at least Free as a Bird has got a low B note. I think it does.
I think you're right.
And it's just so strange to think of Paul McCartney playing a 5-string bass somehow, though it shouldn't be. But yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
What if he ever played a hammer? Tom Peterson, the 10 and 12 and 8-string basses. It's more of a rhythmic instrument rather than a lead instrument, I suppose.
Yeah. Seems like something he would have tried at some point. Like, this is going to be a different sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't know of any records in particular.
He had the Yamaha, the Wal 5-string, and then any number of Fender basses and the Hofner and Rick.
Yeah.
Seem to be the ones that I know about.
You talked about before the White Album having that Fender sound on some of the tracks, but not all of it, like Glass Onion specifically, being kind of a bright, more, what would be the word?
Attack.
Really sort of cutting, almost endless-ish. Yeah.
Yes.
Trebly bass.
Yeah, it has a kind of, like, to my ears, it's like a clank. There's like a clanky sound, not in a bad way. That sounds like a bad thing, but there's just this kind of like heavy, bright attack, almost like metallic sounding attack too.
Percussive, like a Helter Skelter.
You can even hear a little string buzz in there, which a little string buzz, which it gives it a completely different thing than the Rick or the Hofner. But yeah, it's those songs, especially on Glass Onion and Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey, that sound like the Jazz to me.
Yeah.
And I think that bass also inspired him to do some adventurous stuff, especially those two tunes have a lot of those, like funky stuff, but a lot of these slides, quick slides.
Yeah. I wonder, was
That's
it
exactly
the
what I was
jazz
going to say, is that how much the instrument influences what comes out of it.
I think it has a big impact because, if you're playing something and it's like, this would have sounded good on the Hofner and it's not working here, like, you're probably not going to play it. Or, if you get into like playing and there's kind of a sweet spot in the neck where the tone is just like so good, kind of going to hang around in that part of the neck. I'm sure it had some kind of sound that brought something new out of him.
Absolutely.
So I think we already know yours, Rob, but I'll ask the question to both of you now. Favorite McCartney bass lines, speaking as guys who play bass, are the ones that are like, wow, I wish I'd come up with that?
Yeah, I think I said Lovely Rita, my favorite all time. Something is up there. And Dear Prudence, I love. Sexy Sadie, I love. Penny Lane, I love. No, I'm just gonna name all of the songs. Especially those 67 bass lines. That's my favorite era, and a lot of my favorite bass lines are from that era.
Yeah, me too. Actually, I would say that there are different things I like about different lines and different tracks. Some stuff is more melodic and like beautiful and sort of compositionally amazing. Some stuff is more rhythmically exciting and like kind of unique. I love Baby You're a Rich Man. You brought that up earlier because it's super funky and there's all this like pick muting. It's like pick funk basically.
Yeah.
And a lot of just, he's sort of going crazy and again on somebody else's song.
Yeah.
That era, I'm with you. 67, 68, 66, that era when he's got into the Rick and sort of there's something special about that. I always loved You Know My Name because just for pocket.
Yeah.
Not even, it's a great part and moving part, kind of like a walking bass line, like you said. But it's such a deep pocket for such a goofy song. It's apparently a throwaway song. This groove that they hit is like, it's beautiful. It's so funky. That's maybe one of my favorite ones for the rhythmic aspect.
Yeah, it's such a deep, like fat groove.
Yes.
Yeah, like you said, for a silly song, it has just like the deepest pocket.
It just lay back in the cut. It's greasy, it's like super greasy for these white dudes from Liverpool.
Right.
Were both of you inspired by Paul to take up the bass when he could have taken up guitar?
Yes. Well, so I became a Beatles fan when I was 13. I saw Paul McCartney sing Hey Jude on Saturday Night Live. It was a rerun in the summer of 1993. I went from basically not caring about music to being absolutely obsessed with music. Like overnight, I was just like, this performance of Hey Jude, like reached through the TV and grabbed in this way that music never had before. And so I immediately was just like spending all of my allowance on Beatles tapes and reading Beatles books. And about the third book that I read about the Beatles, I was reading for the third time about like them getting hit in the same way by rock and roll when they were teenagers. And like it hit them in this way where like they also just had to learn to play it. And I have this very vivid memory of like reading this third book in my bed and like reading this part about them learning to play. And I put the book down, like went into the guest room, grabbed this guitar that was in the closet and like started learning to play guitar. And then I was so in love with the Beatles and that like, I've got to form a band. I've got to convince my friends to also learn to play guitar. And I think like one or two other friends had guitars and I was like trying to talk one of them into switching to bass. I was like, we need a bass player. You need to switch to bass. And no one else was like that committed. So I ended up switching to bass. But this was probably like, I think I had been playing guitar for a month. I was not a guitar player yet. So I bought a bass and started taking bass lessons and then started playing in bands and then went to school and majored in music, then went to grad school and eventually earned a doctorate in music and all like, I can trace this whole thing back to McCartney singing Hey Jude on SN.
What an amazing thing. You could point to the exact moment your life was changed.
Yeah.
And it was because of Paul McCartney.
100%. It was like before that, at like 15 minutes before that, I was like thinking about sports. And then immediately it was like only thing I cared about was the Beatles. And then that expanded to just like music in general. But so it set me on this path to becoming a musician. I didn't make a decision that like Paul is my favorite, so I'm going to play bass. It was like, I can't talk anybody else into playing bass. So I guess I'm a bass player now.
Well, it's a bit of an echo of his story, isn't it?
100%. Yeah, totally.
And isn't that funny how it's always like that? It's always like, well, nobody wants to play bass, so you do it. Okay. But then you become a bass player and you suddenly discover this secret treasure trove of like
Yeah.
not only an amazing instrument, but you realize you're kind of the secret captain of the band in a
Yeah.
way. You're guiding the melodic part and the rhythm together.
Yeah.
And so very quietly, you're part of the band leader position. It's just a wonderful thing to be. I'm sure he discovered that too.
Yeah, he has definitely talked about that, like how much at some point he realized how much control he had over the music being the bass player. And that was when he really embraced his role as bass player.
How about you?
Yeah, it's similar to you. The Beatles informed my all growing up, and I was hearing Beatles music since I was a kid. I'm older than you, I think, and I saw Wings Over America in San Francisco in '76. My dad took me, and I just was very lucky like that. I inherited a bunch of records when I was a toddler, and my parents were hippies, so my dad was a player. So there was a lot of rock and roll in my house growing up and a lot of shows. But it wasn't like, yeah, Paul plays bass, so I want to play bass. It was not like that. I was similarly, nobody else wanted to play bass. Here, you're okay at guitar. All these guys we're all better than you. Do this one. It's only got 4 strings. And then when I got it, I'm like, wait a minute, this is actually pretty hip. So, but the Beatles similarly were the sort of like at the root of everything, the impetus that informed my knowledge and my vocabulary and just gave me the base to build on and the love for music, for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Bass, everyone's second choice instrument.
Yet somehow the coolest.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I play guitar, I can play keyboard a little bit, but I don't want to play anything else in a band. I briefly was a rhythm guitar player in a band about 15 years ago. And as soon as I had the opportunity to play bass in the band, I was like, yeah, I'm now the bass player in this band. Bass is my main instrument. It's the only one that I really want to play in a band.
What's incredibly moving to me is we're all different ages, and yet none of us were there at the beginning. We all came into the story at different parts, yet it all transformed our lives in different ways. It got us individually all into making music to varying levels, and this passion for the Beatles led to this curiosity about all kinds of other music that might not have been on our path had not the Beatles sort of stirred that curiosity into wanting to know more. And with the Beatles, it just seems like it's bigger than music. You know, you learn about so much other stuff. Once you glom onto the Beatles story and these little detours they took, you pick up this, you pick up this, it's just an incredible vehicle for taking you all kinds of places you might not have gone otherwise.
Yeah. It shapes your life. Like my peer groups, since I became a musician, like my friends have been musicians. Like the people that I bond with are the people that I play in bands with. And now like we go to conferences and present about the Beatles, and like our friends are other people who present about the Beatles at these conferences. It's not
now
just
it's all this.
like, yeah.
Now it's all this. Shocked and stunned.
I was working in the studio, and there's a group there who's very into this techno stuff, and the bass player was up in the hospitality room, and he got the call, come down and do your bass part. So he said, great, it's your big chance, go on, go have fun, So he goes down, he's back up in about 4 minutes. We said, well, that was quick, must have got it in one take. He said, they only wanted one note, donk, and then they put it in the computer. Yeah. He's been studying all those years to go, donk.
Something About the Beatles, created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez, executive producer Rick Way, title song performed by the Corgis.
Something About the Beatles is an evergreen podcast.
Right, okay, bit of bass, here we go. Headphones, click track, bass, my old Hofner bass, my little baby. Come on, baby. The bass on this track is very simple. The bass part is really simple, and it just basically goes, see, it's the D minor, it's following all the chords obviously. Pretty straight root notes, which is basically the notes of the chords. So it's kind of, I've got too much on my plate, don't have no time to A, decent lover, D minor, do 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 C, waiting for D minor again, do do C, D minor, C, D minor, F, chorus coming up. Do bum 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 bum. E minor, D minor, to C, bam 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 bam. That's basically what happens. So I'll try it now. Try and lay it on those tracks where we've got the acoustic guitar and the drums, and now a bit of bass. Okay, let's try it. Here we go. Come on, boy. I've got too much on my plate. I've no time to be a decent lover. I hope it isn't too late. Searching for the time that'll come so fast. The time that I thought would last. My ever-present past. The things I think I did. I did. For the things I think I did when I was a kid. When I was a kid. Okay, so that's it. That should be bass. And that's it. Very simple. You can do fiddly bits if you want. At the end there, I was tempted to myself would have been things I think I did when I was a kid. Just on the E minor. Bum, 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 bum. But those things are up to you. You know, if you either want to keep the straight notes, it's very simple, or if you're feeling adventurous, you can go up here on the E minor and sort of fiddle around a bit. D minor, C. My ever-present past.
Tis the season for all your holiday favorites, like A Very Jonas Christmas Movie and Home Alone on Disney+.
Did I burn down the joint? I don't think so.
Then Hulu has National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation.
We're all in for a very big Christmas treat.
All of these and more streaming this holiday season. And right now, save big with our special Black Friday offer. Bundle Disney Plus and Hulu for just $4.99 a month for 1 year. Savings compared to current regular monthly price. Ends 12/1. Offer for ad-supported Disney Plus Hulu bundle only. Then $12.99 a month or then current regular monthly price. 18 plus terms apply.